The major interpretations of Revelation mentioned previously all have to do with when they say that key events take place relative to Christ's first advent in our present day time. This may be whether they put these events in the past, in the present, in the future, or splitting the difference. But unfortunately, due to the complexity of Revelation and its beauty, this is just the beginning of the possible interpretations. The next category of interpretations, which we will consider, have to do with how people interpret the timing and the nature of the 1,000-year period found in Revelation 20. This period is called the Millennium and is Latin for 1,000 years. There are two distinct events that are said to last 1,000 years found in the book of Revelation. The first is Satan's binding for 1,000 years, and the second is Christ's reign with His saints for 1,000 years. Unlike previous interpretations, it is more difficult to cleanly characterize the interpretations of the millennium due to the many differences between them. There are four major differences between these interpretations. The first is when they say the beginning and the end of the millennium take place relative to the first and second advent of Jesus Christ. Second, the conditions of man's spiritual state at the return of Christ. Third, the nature of the 1,000 years, whether it be literal, figurative, or symbolic. And finally, the nature of Christ's kingdom reign, whether it is heavenly and spiritual or earthly and literal. There are four major interpretations of the millennium: amillennialism, postmillennialism, premillennialism, and fulfilled millennialism. As before, I believe a picture best helps understand the differences between these views. The following, we will show timelines and summaries of the major interpretations of the millennium. But first, let's define the key events that help us interpret the millennium. First is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the reign of Christ with His saints, Satan being bound, and finally, the second coming of Christ. We will consider amillennialism first. The timing. The 1,000 years is figurative or symbolic of a long period of time. The period extends into our present age. The second coming of Christ. Jesus Christ will return in the future after the millennium. This is followed by the resurrection and judgment of the dead. Christ's reign. Christ currently reigns with His saints from heaven. His kingdom is spiritual. Jesus does not set up a literal kingdom here on earth. His reign began in the past at the ascension into heaven. The binding of Satan. Satan was bound in the past at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. His binding is symbolic of his inability to prevent the spread of gospel throughout the nations. Man's spiritual state. Mankind will become more and more apostate until Jesus returns, although there will always be a Christian remnant. The second major interpretation is postmillennialism, the timing. The 1,000 years is figurative or symbolic of a long period of time. The period extends into the present age. This is the same as amil. Christ's second return. Jesus Christ will return in the future after the millennium. This is followed by the resurrection and judgment of the dead. Again, the same as amil. Christ's kingdom. Christ currently reigns with His saints from heaven. His kingdom is spiritual. Jesus does not set up a literal kingdom here on earth, and His reign began in the past at His ascension to heaven. Again, the same as amil. The binding of Satan. Satan was bound in the past at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. His binding is symbolic of his inability to prevent the spread of the gospel through the nation. Again, the same as amil. the spiritual state of man. Here's where post-mill differs significantly from amill. Mankind will become more and more Christianized until Jesus returns. The third major interpretation of the millennium is premillennialism. This is popular among futurists and dispensationalists. The timing. The 1,000 years are literal and in the future. The second coming of Christ. Jesus Christ's second coming will occur before the millennium. Christ's reign. Christ will begin his reign with the saints after a future tribulation. His kingdom will be a literal, physical kingdom based in Jerusalem. The binding of Satan. Also after a future tribulation, Satan is bound for a literal 1,000 years. The spiritual state of man. Mankind will become more and more apostate until Jesus returns, although there will always be a Christian remnant. And this, premill, is very similar to amill. The final major interpretation of Revelation, although it is not nearly widely as known as the other interpretations, are fulfilled millennialism, although you may know it as bimill, which Kurt Simmons popularized, or as transmill or transmillennialism, as Max King calls it. The timing. The 1,000 years is figurative, symbolizing the blessed state of the saints in heaven. This is based on 2 Peter 3 and 8 and Psalms 90 and 4, and was fulfilled in the past. Christ's second return. Jesus Christ returned after the millennium, similar to amill and postmill, which was followed by the resurrection and the judgment of the dead. Christ's reign. Although Christ currently reigns with the saints, this period refers to his reign from heaven in the past between his ascension and second coming. His kingdom is spiritual and heavenly. The binding of Satan. Satan was bound in the past at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. His binding is symbolic of his inability to prevent the spread of the gospel through the nations. Man's spiritual state. Some portions of mankind will become more and more apostate before Christ's return, but God protected his remnant, the church. This concludes the interpretations of the millennium. See also the next section, various interpretations of the order of the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 plagues on my website, thepreteristpost.com.